"He's not
Stay
mine."
with me, please.
Thrown into the snow by her
Don't leave
husband,
me.
the Alpha King
We're
smelled her
almost
wound and
there.
growled. The wind whispered through the towers as if carrying secrets from the past, secrets that had been buried beneath centuries of ice. Queen Alara walked through the corridors, her breath clouding in the cold air. Her gown, heavy and dark as the night sky, swept along the floor, leaving faint trails on the frosty stone. She kept her eyes low, for she knew the eyes of the Alpha King were everywhere. King Kalen was a storm in human form. His presence dominated every room, every hall, every silent shadow. Even when he did not speak, the castle seemed to tremble beneath his gaze. He had married Alara months ago, a union meant to secure the throne, but it had not brought warmth. Instead, it had brought tension, suspicion, and an invisible cage she could feel in every heartbeat. Alara paused before a tall window, staring out at the frozen courtyard where the servants hurried, heads bowed, carrying supplies to prepare for the coming winter. Her thoughts drifted to the secret she had carried in silence, the faint, pulsing power within her, an inheritance from a lineage long thought extinguished. This power had whispered to her since her childhood, guiding her steps in shadowed forests and abandoned ruins. Now it throbbed with new life, a silent warning she could neither ignore nor fully understand. Her reflection in the glass startled her. She saw a woman framed in frost and sorrow, yet her eyes held a strange fire. She wondered how long she could keep the secret hidden from Kalen, whose instincts were sharper than any sword. That night, the great hall was lit by torches that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Nobles from distant lands gathered for the winter council, their whispers drifting like smoke in the vast chamber. Kalen sat at the high table, his expression unreadable, his hands folded as though holding back a storm. Ilara moved among the guests, offering polite nods, keeping her words measured, her heart pounding under the weight of his scrutiny. It was during the council that the first spark of conflict erupted. A messenger brought news of a distant village attacked by frost wolves, creatures of legend thought extinct. The nobles murmured in fear, but Kalen's eyes narrowed at Alara. "You heard this news," he said, his voice low and commanding. "What is your judgment?" Alara hesitated. Speaking aloud meant revealing her knowledge of forces that few could comprehend, but she could not remain silent. "The frost wolves are drawn to power," she said carefully. "They sense something unusual, something growing in the north." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to flicker in hesitation. Kalen's gaze bore into her, sharp and accusing. "And what, pray tell, do you know of such matters?" he asked, the faintest edge of anger in his tone. I know only that they follow strength," Alara replied, steadying herself. "And strength can be guided." Kalen rose from his chair, the hall seeming to shrink under his presence. He walked toward her, each step echoing in the chamber until he stood just a few feet away. "Strength. Or a dangerous secret?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His eyes searched her face as though trying to unravel a hidden truth. Alara felt the pull of his attention, both terrifying and magnetic. She could not tell if he sought to destroy her or to understand her. Her pulse quickened and she clenched her hands at her sides. The hall, full of nobles and torchlight, faded away in her awareness. There was only Kalen and the storm he carried. Before she could answer, a loud crash interrupted them. One of the windows had shattered and snow swirled into the hall, carried by the icy wind. Servants rushed to close it, their faces pale with fear. Kalen's gaze snapped to the courtyard, then back to her. "You cannot hide forever," he said, almost in a whisper. "The kingdom will know what you are, or it will burn." Alara swallowed hard. The words were not a threat, yet they carried the weight of inevitability. She turned from him, trying to calm the fluttering of her heart. That night, alone in her chambers, she felt the power within her stir with an intensity she had never known. It was not merely a whisper anymore. It was a voice, urging her to rise, to claim a destiny she had barely begun to understand. The cold night pressed against the castle walls as Alara wrapped herself in her cloak and stepped onto the balcony. The snow reflected the pale light of the moon, and the wind carried a strange, almost sentient chill. She thought of the child growing within her, a life bound to her bloodline, a life tied to the destiny she could not yet fully see. A sudden shiver ran through her, not from cold, but from the realization that everything she had known was about to change. The next morning, Kalen summoned her to the tower overlooking the northern lands. His expression was unreadable as always, but there was a storm behind his eyes. "You feel it," he said simply, referring to the power she had tried to conceal. "Do you understand what it means?" "I feel it," she admitted, her voice soft, "but I do not understand it." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Then you are more dangerous than I thought, not for what you are, but for what you cannot control." His words cut deeper than any sword. Alara wanted to argue, to claim that she could learn to wield her power, but she knew the truth in his gaze. He did not trust her, and perhaps he could never trust her. Days passed, and tension between them grew like a living thing. Every glance carried weight, every word a test. The frost wolves returned, not in packs but as shadows at the edges of the kingdom. Their howls echoed in the night, a haunting reminder of the curse that hovered over her bloodline. The castle trembled under the cold, and whispers of Alara's lineage began to reach ears that were not meant to hear. Then, one night, everything shattered. Kalen confronted her in the snow-laden courtyard. His eyes were storm gray, his breath misting in the freezing air. "Tell me what you hide," he demanded, "or leave this castle forever." Alara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I hide nothing that you would understand." Kalen's hand shot out, not to strike but to grasp her arm. "Then perhaps you belong to the night, not to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The cold wind tore at her cloak, and before she could react, he released her with a force that sent her stumbling into the snow. She fell hard, the cold biting her skin, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Alara lay in the snow, staring up at the stormy sky. Her mind raced, torn between anger, fear, and a strange longing she could not name. The snow around her glistened like shards of glass, mirroring the fracture that had opened between them. She could hear the distant roar of Kalen, a sound both terrifying and heartbreakingly human, fading into the night. And then from the swirling storm a shadow emerged, a figure cloaked in darkness, moving with a grace that seemed almost unreal. It stopped just before her, extending a hand. "You are not alone," the figure whispered, voice like wind through the trees. "The power you carry, it is not a curse but a destiny. Choose wisely, or all will be lost." Alara looked from the figure to the castle above, where Kalen stood as a distant silhouette. She felt the weight of the snow, the cold seeping into her bones, and the pulse of her hidden power stirring within her. Her heart ached, torn between the storm she had fallen from and the shadow offering guidance. She did not yet know which path she would take, only that the world she had known, the castle, the throne, and the Alpha King, had been shattered forever. The wind howled louder, carrying whispers of prophecy and warning. And in the snow, Alara realized that her journey had only just begun. The wind had grown colder, sharper, as if the mountains themselves were sighing in warning. Alara followed the shadowed figure through a forest of blackened pines, their branches bending under the weight of ice. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that her life had changed forever. The snow crunched beneath her boots with every cautious step, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence of the forest. The figure moved with a quiet authority, a presence that was at once comforting and unnerving. When they finally stopped, Alara saw the ruins of an old temple, its stones cracked and covered in frost. The air here felt different, alive with magic, and tinged with a soft hum that seemed to echo inside her bones. "This is a place of truth," the figure said. Their voice was calm but carried weight, as if centuries of secrets lay behind it. "Here you will understand what you are, and what is meant to grow within you." Alara stepped closer, feeling the warmth of the figure's presence against the biting cold. She did not know if she should trust them, but she knew she had no choice. Kalen's anger, his fear, and his demand for control still haunted her like the echo of distant thunder. Yet here, in the ruins, she felt the first flicker of hope. "You speak as if my power is a gift," she said quietly, "but it is a curse. It will bring only destruction, just as it has brought frost wolves and fear." The figure shook their head slowly. "Power is never evil on its own. It is how you use it that decides your path. The blood you carry is not only of curse, but of destiny." "Your child," they paused, letting the words hang in the icy air, "will be the key to a future even the throne cannot imagine." Alara's heart clenched at the thought. Her unborn child was a living bond between the past and what was yet to come. She could feel the stirring of life within her, fragile and fierce all at once. She wrapped her arms around her belly instinctively, her breath catching in the cold air. "Why me?" she asked the shadowed figure. "Why was I chosen for this?" "Not chosen," the figure corrected gently. "Born. The blood runs in your veins because it must. The frost that hunts you, the shadows that whisper your name, they are drawn to your strength, and strength cannot remain hidden forever." Alara sank onto the frost-covered stone, the cold biting through her gown. "I am not ready," she whispered. "I do not want to be ready, I just want to live." "You cannot run," the figure said softly. "Not from the storm, not from Kalen, and not from yourself. But you can learn. You can shape what comes. The frost wolves will return, and so will the darkness of the court. Only by facing them can you protect what matters." For the first time, Alara allowed herself to breathe. The words, though frightening, carried a truth she could not deny. Her destiny had always been tied to power she barely understood, and to a throne she had once thought unreachable. And now, standing in the ruins, she realized that she had a choice: to embrace the strength within her, or to let it be consumed by fear. Days passed in quiet study beneath the shadowed figure's guidance. They taught her to sense the currents of magic in the wind, to listen to the whispers of the earth beneath her feet, and to understand the subtle rhythm of life and power. Alara discovered that her abilities were not merely destructive. They could protect, heal, and influence the world in ways she had never imagined. Each lesson was difficult, exhausting, and humbling, but with every passing day, she felt herself grow stronger, more aware, and more determined. And yet, even as she trained, Kalen's presence lingered in her thoughts like a storm on the horizon. She imagined him moving through the halls of the castle, surrounded by torches and courtiers, his eyes searching for her. Sometimes she felt anger at his cruelty, the way he had thrown her into the snow, but other times she felt something more complex, a pull she could not name, a longing she did not dare to understand. It was on the fourth night that the frost wolves returned. Their howls cut through the forest like knives, and their shadows darted between the trees with a frightening intelligence. Alara's heart raced, but the shadowed figure stood calm beside her. "You are ready," they said. "Do not fear them. You can guide them." The wolves emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Alara took a deep breath, closing her eyes to feel the flow of power inside her. She reached out with her mind, a silent command that trembled through the air. The wolves halted, ears twitching, and then, as if recognizing her strength, they bowed their heads and moved aside, vanishing into the night as silently as they had appeared. Alara opened her eyes, stunned by what she had accomplished. She had felt the frost wolves as part of herself, their danger transformed into obedience through her will alone. For the first time, she realized that she was not helpless, that she could control the power that had frightened her, and maybe, one day, even the Alpha King. The shadowed figure placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are stronger than you know, but strength is not enough. The court, the king, the throne, they are all tests. Soon, you will have to face them, and nothing in these ruins can prepare you fully." Alara nodded, her resolve hardening. "I will face them," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "But I will not be broken again." Her thoughts returned to Kalen. She knew he would not stop searching for her. His pride, his fear, his obsession with control, it would lead him to the ruins sooner or later. And when he arrived, everything would change. She would have to face him, not as a frightened queen, but as someone who held power he could not ignore. That day came sooner than she expected. A distant howl carried through the forest, and Alara's senses sharpened. Kalen was approaching, moving through the snow with a presence that seemed to push the cold aside. Her heart pounded, a mix of fear, anger, and something she could not yet name. She had learned to stand in storms, to face shadows, but standing before Kalen would test her in ways the frost wolves never could. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, his cloak whipping in the wind, eyes scanning the ruins until they landed on her. "Alara," he called, his voice both command and plea. "Why have you fled? What are you hiding?" She stepped forward, the lessons of the past weeks solidifying within her. "I am hiding nothing," she said, her voice steady. "But I am learning what I am, what I must become." Kalen's gaze softened slightly, and yet a shadow of doubt flickered across his face. "And what is that?" he asked, taking a cautious step closer. "I am not yours to command," she said, "and I am not yours to fear, but I will protect this kingdom, and I will protect what is growing inside me no matter the cost." For a long moment neither moved. The snow fell around them in a quiet, hypnotic rhythm. Then Kalen's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something that startled her, a recognition of strength she had only just begun to understand. Before either could speak again, a sudden tremor shook the ground. Ice cracked and fell from the frozen trees, and the whispers of unseen spirits rose around them. The shadowed figure appeared between them, eyes wide with warning. "The prophecy is not yet complete," they said urgently. "The blood within you awakens more than even you can control. Beware, for forces beyond the frost are stirring." Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. Kalen's presence was a storm beside her, yet the power within her was a fire growing stronger by the second. She knew in that moment that the path ahead would not be easy. Trust, control, and understanding, all would be tested. And yet, even in the face of danger, she could not deny the pull she felt toward the Alpha King, the man who had once cast her into the snow and now stood before her, a figure of both fear and fascination. The snow swirled faster, carrying voices of the past, whispers of power and destiny, and the distant howl of frost wolves that had not yet returned. Alara's heart clenched. She had learned to wield her strength, but the true test, the one that would determine the fate of the throne, the kingdom, and the life growing within her, had only just begun. And as the storm raged around them, she realized that the story of Alara and Kalen was far from over. It had only deepened into a tale of power, prophecy, and a connection neither could yet fully comprehend. The journey back to the castle was harsher than Alara had expected. Snowstorms blanketed the road, and the wind whipped around her cloak like a living thing, carrying whispers of warning. Each step was a struggle, each breath a reminder of how far she had come, and how far she still had to go. The shadowed figure had guided her this far, teaching her to channel her power, to understand the rhythm of the frost, and to sense the hidden threads that connected life, magic, and destiny. Yet now, as the spires of Kalen's fortress appeared through the storm, Alara felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. This was the place where her power had been feared, where her secrets had almost destroyed her. And still, she knew she could not turn back. The gates loomed high and cold, guarded by soldiers who paused at her approach, their faces betraying surprise. She had returned alone, and yet there was a strength about her that made them step aside, hesitant but respectful. She drew her cloak tighter and pushed through, her eyes fixed on the towers where Kalen would surely be waiting. Inside, the castle felt different. The warmth of the hearths did not reach the halls she walked, and the silence seemed heavier than the snow outside. Alara could feel the watchful eyes of the courtiers, the lingering suspicion in the air. Every step echoed, carrying with it the weight of her return. Kalen awaited her in the main hall, standing tall before the throne. His gray eyes met hers immediately, a storm of emotion reflected in their depths. Relief, anger, curiosity, and something unspoken all swirled together. He did not move, only observed, as if measuring the change in her, the shift in her presence that had taken place in the frozen ruins. "You've returned," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. "Why?" Alara met his gaze evenly. "Because I must," she said. "Because the throne, the kingdom, and everything that matters cannot survive without facing the truth. And the truth is, I am no longer the woman you cast into the snow." Kalen's eyes flickered with surprise and then with something darker, respect perhaps, though he would never admit it. "You have grown," he said cautiously. "But power is not all. Knowledge is not all. Strength alone will not protect you from the enemies you cannot see." Alara nodded. "I know that now, but I have learned that strength without fear is the first step." Their words hung in the hall, charged with tension neither could name. Courtiers whispered at the edges of the room, but Kalen's gaze never wavered from hers. He stepped closer, the air between them thick with unspoken conflict, unacknowledged longing, and a history neither could erase. "Then show me," he said, almost a challenge. "Show me that you are no longer afraid." Alara lifted her hand slightly, feeling the familiar pulse of power beneath her skin. She did not speak, only focused, letting the frost around her stir in response. The air in the hall grew colder, snow-like motes dancing in circles above the stone floor. The courtiers gasped, some taking steps back, but Kalen remained, his eyes locked on hers. It was a silent test, a battle of wills. And when Alara exhaled, letting her power flow, the frost settled into delicate patterns across the hall, a display of control rather than chaos. Kalen's jaw tightened, and for the first time his expression softened into a look that was neither anger nor judgment, but understanding. "You have learned," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "And yet the kingdom will not forgive mistakes." Alara nodded. "Nor will the enemies that lurk in shadow. The frost wolves are not gone, and the whispers of the past still linger. I am ready to face them, with or without you." Kalen's eyes darkened with emotion she could not read. For a moment he looked like the storm she had known before, full of pride, anger, and raw strength. And then, as if conceding to something he could not fight, he nodded. "Then we faced them together." The next days were a whirlwind. Alara moved through the castle with a purpose she had not known before. She trained with the guards, learning how to combine her magic with physical skill. She studied maps of the northern lands, noting the places where frost wolves had been seen and where the shadows of dark forces were strongest. Kalen remained close, sometimes observing silently, sometimes offering guidance that was more restraint than command. And all the while, tension simmered between them. Every glance carried unspoken questions. Every word was layered with meaning. They tested each other constantly, their interactions a dance of power and pride. Alara could feel the pull toward him, both fear and fascination, and she sensed that he felt the same, though he would never speak it aloud. Then came the attack. A messenger arrived at the gates, breathless and wide-eyed. "The northern villages are under assault," he said, voice trembling. "Not by frost wolves, but by shadows that move like living darkness. They consume the light and flee when confronted, leaving only fear and ruin." Kalen's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, and Alara felt the surge of her own power in response. "We leave at once," he said, his voice sharp with command. "Gather the guards and prepare the city. Alara, you will come with me." She nodded. Fear and determination swirled together inside her, but she knew she could not refuse. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment that would test her strength, her control, and perhaps even her connection with Kalen. The journey north was treacherous. The shadows seemed to cling to the edges of the road. whispering fears and doubts into the minds of those who traveled with them. Alara felt the pull of her power, guiding her through the danger, protecting those who could not see the invisible threat. She and Kaelin moved in a careful rhythm, their combined presence a force that kept the darkness at bay. Yet even in the midst of battle, the tension between them never eased. Kaelin would glance at her, a flicker of emotion crossing his stormy eyes, and she would meet it with equal measure. Words were unnecessary. Every movement, every gesture, every shared glance carried meaning. They were partners in survival, and yet something deeper simmered beneath the surface, something that neither dared to name aloud. The final confrontation came at the edge of a frozen lake, where the shadows had gathered in a swirling mass of darkness. The frost beneath their feet cracked with the weight of magic and power. Kaelin drew his sword, its edge gleaming like steel in the pale light, and Alara extended her hands, feeling the currents of frost rise to meet her will. "Together," Kaelin said, his voice low but steady. "No matter what comes." Alara nodded, her heart pounding. She had never felt such a combination of fear and certainty, anger and hope, all in one moment. And as the shadows surged toward them, she and Kaelin stood side by side, their powers intertwined, their wills united against the darkness. The battle was fierce, the shadows shifting and attacking in unpredictable patterns. Alara's magic struck with precision, freezing some and scattering others. Kaelin moved with skill and strategy, defending her and the soldiers, his movements fluid and commanding. They were a storm together, fierce and unyielding. And then, in the chaos, Alara felt a surge unlike any she had experienced before. The unborn child within her stirred, and a wave of power radiated outward, scattering the shadows and leaving only stillness in its wake. She fell to her knees, exhausted but alive, and Kaelin was immediately at her side, supporting her with a strength she had never expected to see. "You are extraordinary," he said, his voice soft now, almost vulnerable. "Stronger than I ever imagined." Alara looked up at him, her breath ragged. "We are stronger together," she replied. For a moment, silence fell over the frozen lake. The storm had passed, leaving only the cold wind and the faint shimmer of frost. And in that silence, a new understanding passed between them, not words but something deeper. Trust, respect, and a connection born of struggle and survival. But even as they caught their breath, a distant sound reached their ears, a whispering wind, carrying a message from the north, a warning of forces still greater than the shadows they had faced. Alara's heart clenched. She had learned to wield her power, she had faced Kaelin without fear, and yet the path ahead was far from over. The storm was not yet over, and the winter's reckoning was only beginning. The wind had grown still, but the air was thick with tension. Alara and Kaelin stood before the throne chamber, its doors carved with ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with magic. The crown itself glimmered under the torchlight, an emblem of power and responsibility, and a reminder that the fate of Varendor rested on the choices they would make. Alara felt the life within her stir, a gentle yet powerful presence that resonated with the energy of the room. She knew, in a way that went beyond thought, that her child was part of the prophecy, the key to both danger and salvation. And she also knew that Kaelin, for all his strength and fury, had grown as much as she had. He had faced the shadows, accepted her power, and stood beside her, not as an enemy but as an ally. Kaelin's gray eyes met hers, holding questions and emotions neither had fully expressed. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "There is no turning back from this." Alara nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the edge of the throne steps. "I am ready, but we must be careful. The prophecy, it is not complete yet. There is still more to face." The air in the chamber shifted suddenly, colder than the winter winds outside. Shadows began to gather along the edges of the room, twisting and stretching as though alive. They moved with purpose, coiling toward the throne like black smoke hungry for power. Alara felt a pulse of fear, but it was tempered by determination. She would not falter, not now. Kalen drew his sword, its edge catching the torchlight. "We face them together," he said. "No hesitation." Alara extended her hands, feeling the frost and energy within her respond to the threat. The shadows writhed and lunged, but her control was precise. They met her power and recoiled, scattering into smaller shapes. Kalen struck with precision, cutting through the darkness with skill and strategy. Together, they were a storm of force and magic, balancing each other perfectly. Yet the shadows did not retreat completely. From the center of the chamber, a larger, darker form emerged, a presence that felt ancient and malevolent. Alara felt her pulse quicken as the energy of the room shifted. This was not merely a test of strength. It was a challenge to her spirit, her will, and the destiny she had inherited. The figure spoke, its voice echoing in the hall like 1,000 whispers. "You think yourselves ready. You think your bond can stand against me. Yet the womb of fire holds more than you know." Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. The prophecy had spoken of fire and frost, of power and blood. Her child was the living key, and she realized that controlling the power would require every ounce of her focus, courage, and trust in Kalen. Kalen stepped closer to her, his presence steadying her. "We are ready," he said, not as a command, but as a promise. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Alara nodded, feeling the warmth of his words. It was more than comfort. It was a connection that had grown through fear, struggle, and the shared weight of responsibility. Their combined presence radiated energy, a shield of power that seemed to repel the darkness. The shadowed figure raised its hand, and the chamber erupted in a storm of swirling magic. The floor cracked with light and frost, and the very walls seemed to tremble. Alara and Kalen held their ground, drawing on each other's strength. Frost met shadow, fire met darkness, and the air was thick with energy so potent it left the courtiers outside the doors trembling in awe. Alara focused, feeling her child within her respond. A warmth radiated outward, gentle but unstoppable, pushing back against the shadows with the force of life itself. The black shape recoiled, letting out a sound that was neither human nor animal, a cry that spoke of fury and fear. Kalen's sword struck true, splitting the largest tendrils of darkness. "Now, Alara," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. With a deep breath, Alara extended her hands fully, letting the magic of her bloodline surge into the chamber. The shadows screamed and twisted, then scattered like ashes in the wind. The ancient presence that had loomed over the throne collapsed into nothingness, leaving silence in its wake. Alara fell to her knees, exhausted but alive. Kalen was immediately at her side, steadying her with strong hands. "You did it," he said, his voice soft, almost awed. "You controlled it, all of it." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "We did it," she corrected, placing a hand on his arm. "Together." For the first time in months, a quiet peace filled the throne chamber. The storm outside seemed to calm, the snow resting lightly against the windows and the chill in the air softened. The shadows were gone, the threat ended for now. But Alara knew the balance of power was delicate. Every victory carried its price, every choice a consequence. Kalen's gaze lingered on her, and she felt the pull of unspoken emotions between them. Pride, relief, concern, and something more subtle, something that had grown in the silences, the shared battles, the moments of understanding. He knelt beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed, and for a moment neither spoke. "Do you trust me?" he asked finally, his voice low and hesitant. Alara smiled faintly, the warmth in her chest outweighing the fatigue in her body. "I trust you," she said, "more than I ever thought I could. Not because you are the king, but because you stood with me when I needed you most." Kalen's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that spoke of protection, respect, and something deeper. "Then we have survived more than storms and shadows," he said. "We have survived ourselves." The courtiers who had gathered at the edges of the hall watched silently, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. No words could capture what had transpired, the silent pact formed between the two rulers. For Alara and Kalen, victory was not just the defeat of shadows, but the acknowledgement of trust, strength, and a bond forged in the harshest of trials. Days passed, and the castle began to return to life. Fires burned brighter, guards moved with renewed purpose, and the nobles spoke of the courage and power of their rulers. Yet for Alara, the true significance lay not in the court's approval, but in the quiet moments when Kaelin's eyes met hers, and she felt the unspoken promise between them. One evening, as the sun set behind the frozen peaks, Alara stood on the balcony, watching the snow glisten like shards of silver. Kaelin joined her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "The prophecy has not ended," he said quietly, "but we have faced the worst of it. And whatever comes next, we will face together." Alara nodded, feeling the warmth of his presence, the strength of their shared will and the life growing within her. "Together," she repeated, letting the word anchor her spirit. The wind carried a soft whisper through the towers, the echo of ancient power now at peace. The throne was no longer just a symbol of rule. It was a testament to endurance, courage, and unity. Alara felt the weight of destiny settle around her, no longer as a burden, but as a mantle she was ready to bear. Kaelin's hand found hers, and for the first time there was no fear, no suspicion, only the quiet understanding that had grown between them. "Whatever comes," he said, "you are not mine, but we are bound by something stronger than the crown, stronger than fear, stronger than the shadows." Alara smiled, placing her hand over her child, feeling its heartbeat as a promise of hope. "Then let the kingdom watch," she said softly. "We are ready." Outside, the first thaw of spring began to show along the edges of the forest. Snow melted into streams, the frozen ground softened, and the sun cast golden light across the land. It was a new beginning, not just for Varendor, but for the queen, the king, and the life that would carry forward the legacy of courage, love, and unity. And in the quiet of the throne chamber, Alara realized that her story, Kaelin's story, and the kingdom's story were no longer fractured by fear or shadows. They were whole, bound by trust, tested by fire and frost, and ready to face whatever destiny awaited. Together they would endure, together they would rise, together they would shape the future.